Mic check 1 2, one time for your mind. I'm Architect AP and you're listening to Versus Everything. Welcome back. I thought today I would talk to you about the different generations. The reason why I thought that would be a good idea is because, it lays a good foundation for discussing just about any topic, because it kind of gives you a layout of the demographic of the people in our society, regardless of their ethnicity, culture, religion, etc. It's the people that were impacted by the different things in history, right? It's the military conflicts, it's the economies, it's the historical events, and what shaped the people in these generations and why they feel and think the way they do. So starting with the silent generation. Silent generation is the generation that is slowly dying out, given that their youngest member at this stage would be about 78 years old. The silent generation are people born between 1928 and 1945. And this is the generation that we kind of really tend to romanticize in a lot of ways, because these were people that have endured a lot of hardships during their youth. They lived through the Great Depression and World War II. They weren't necessarily kind of actors in those things because they were too young to do that, but this is what their youth was influenced by. So, these people, because they've experienced so much negativity in their youth, they grew up to be very kind of risk averse and conservative because of that. And at the same time, because of that, they wanted to improve everything. They wanted to build out of it. They've seen so many bad things. They've seen so much damage. They wanted to make things better. And they really valued hard work and responsibility, for the most part, at that time, that was kind of the motto. It's like, if you work hard, if you stick to the plan, if you do what you got to do, everything's going to be all right, and the system worked that way. Around that time was when the workers kind of organized unions. Workers worked for long periods of time for their employers. They would spend years working the same job and not worry about anything. That was just is what it is. You had a job, you could earn your keep, you're good. During that time was also the kind of the rise of consumerism as we know it. The commercials started showing up everywhere. People wanted you to buy stuff. People were making stuff for you to buy. Suburbs started showing up in ways that we actually know them of as now. These kind of densely populated areas, because, people were working in cities now. People weren't working on farms in rural areas. There was a lot of urban migration. So that generation is always looked at as, the generation that was really these durable, hardworking people. And, I think it's fair to say that, a lot of credit can go to them for the years of prosperity that followed. It was the 50s. They're often kind of looked at as the economic peak of the modern history. And I think this is, this is an important turning point in our history as well, because next came the baby boomers, right? We all know these troublemakers. Baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. 1946 and 1964. And these are the people that they grew up during the best time in history. Their childhoods were great. And I think they often look at it as, the golden years. It was, it was the work ethic of their parents, while at the same time seeing the results that hard work got. But as baby boomers grew up, I think they realized that it was kind of boring, despite the fact that it was actually that all these things paid off. They felt bored by this previous generation. It's also important to remember that baby boomers are the largest generation in history to this day. And I think the reason for that being that the medical advances after World War II really kept a lot of people alive. Because, early in the 20th century, it wasn't uncommon for for people to have, say, 10 kids and only, 6 or 7 of them make it to adulthood, because diseases that you and I take for granted used to kill people in record numbers because there was just no treatment for it. And so, yeah, because of that, baby boomers had a large population. They kind of really went into the economy and the workforce. It was also the generation where women felt a lot more liberated, and they didn't want to just kind of be stay-at-home moms anymore. They wanted to work. So the labor supply in the labor market has increased exponentially during that period of time. Needless to say, I think that was also the turning point as to why the economy kind of went on a downward slope ever since then, because simply just because of sheer amount of people involved. And I think with baby boomers, they also expected this upward mobility. There were all these children of factory workers that, had an expectation that they were going to become these corporate big shots. Everything was going to be better. Their parents built something for them to kind of really flourish in. And at the same time, I think that set the tone for, how this generation was. There was, the civil rights movement really kind of flourished during that time. There was a lot of individuality. There was a lot of, self-expression. The hippies were around, suddenly drugs showed up. Suddenly drug use was, and it was more like recreational in nature as well. It was the psychedelics. It was the marijuana. It was the hippies, the summer of love. And also, yeah, it's important to remember the sexual revolution of that time, because this was the first generation where the use of birth control became, widely accepted. And that created like a full-on sexual revolution, because people at this point could have, shall we say, inconsequential sex, because, involuntary pregnancy wasn't such a big factor anymore. It wasn't like their grandparents who kind of had to get married to touch boob, because every time you did that, a baby would show up. This wasn't a thing anymore, so because of that, people were just sleeping around a lot more. They started partying a lot more, so there was, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. There was also the Vietnam War around that time, which kind of set the tone for this kind of unconformity with the system. The baby boomers didn't kind of conform to these old ideals, and they wanted to change everything and mold society to their own kind of vision. And this is an interesting part of the story, because after baby boomers entered Generation X. Now, Generation X, I think, marks the pivotal point in history, which essentially kind of signifies a bit of a downward slope and everything. And not through their own fault. I think it's more so that they got to experience and live through that. They were shaped by this kind of downward slope. Essentially, Generation X is often known as the middle child of history, the child of the divorce. There was a lot of broken families by that point, because again, divorce became a lot more acceptable in society compared to the previous generations. Gen Xers, again, it's important to remember they were born between 1965 and 1980, right? And I think because of all the kind of economic downturns, because the economy couldn't handle all this activity from baby boomers, the economic downturns and the social upheaval that was around during the years of Generation X created this not so political, but more of a social kind of disassociation for Generation X, which is why I think we don't actually see too much of a political impact out of that generation, but we do see a lot of some of our best pop culture icons and entertainers. Generation X is the generation that gave us the likes of Kurt Cobain, the likes of Tupac Shakur. And you could hear it in their art, this whole rebelliousness against society, this displeasure and disassociation, this kind of angst against existence. And I think for a big part, I think the movie Fight Club really kind of was the punchline for the generation, because it was a time when Generation X were adults, and they grew up through this whole system that never really wanted them. They kind of wanted to compartmentalize them into these kind of robotic jobs and kind of existence of just being there, of buying shit because it's somebody's business now. It's not because it's cool and new, it's just because they need you to buy it. And, I think people's spiritual and, inner peace was really damaged by this kind of thing. And needless to say, though, if I think Generation X should be credited as a very kind of self-reliant and adaptable generation, because for the most part, this generation really kind of had to sink or swim. And of course, up next we have the millennials. Millennials are born between 1981 and 1996. And millennials are an interesting generation because for the most part, because for millennials, their parents were most likely baby boomers, or at least on the cusp of baby boomers and Generation X. Millennials grew up in this in a very rapidly changing environment, probably the fastest changing environment out of any generation alive today, because we're talking about remembering days with not having phones, of not having mobile phones everywhere, of no computer in the house, but no internet. We remember VHS tapes, cassette tapes, CDs. We remember all these things as a reality during our upbringing. But at the same time, we've also got to experience things like internet really taking off. Internet has been around for a while at that point, but it really became what it was during our time. It was the Google, this access to information. You could Google anything. It was the inception of social media. And this was before the likes of Instagram and Facebook. I'm talking about Bebo and MySpace and YouTube being this new thing where people just uploaded videos to share, right? Before it became the content platform that it is now. And I think it's also important to understand the dynamic, this kind of tension between millennials and baby boomers in a lot of ways, because millennials grew up envisioning a bright future because this is what baby boomers expected, because they based it off their own experience. And they told the millennials that they could be anything they wanted to be. The sky's the limit, the world is your oyster. Only to be the same people to give us this dose of reality when we grow up and call us useless and entitled and soft, etc. Basically, you can't afford anything because you eat too much avocado on toast and get too much takeaway coffee. You people are spoiled, and this is why you don't have anything. Needless to say, it's an interesting dynamic because we still live in an economy that is essentially still run by baby boomers in a big way. Millennials also, I think, hit a real stagnation in maturity because of this, because our independence came a lot later in life. It takes a lot longer for millennials to get set up in life these days, to build some sort of a financial base. Home ownership comes a lot later in life because the house prices are way too high. Guess who owns them, right? Because of this, millennials generally start families a lot later as well. Student debt as well. Education became very expensive. So, if you wanted any kind of well-paying job and you wanted to get an education, you'd get a massive student loan, which you'd be paying off before you even get to a mortgage. So, you're screwed well in advance, but at the same time, aside from these things, there are other factors that we grew up with, such as, we've experienced 9/11. We saw the kind of the conflict in the Middle East that followed. We've experienced the global financial crisis of 2008, where, it was hard to find a job. A lot of people lost their jobs. It kind of, really hit society quite hard. So, it was an interesting time to be alive. But in saying that, I think as millennials matured, millennials started kind of becoming quite idealistic about things, and I think a lot of things that are attributed to Gen Z such as, these like identity politics and things about pronouns and virtue signaling, the left and the right. I think millennials are actually responsible for that more so than anybody else. And I think this is the generation that is going to be the kind of the dirty version of the change that we would like to see. And of course, last but not least, we have Gen Z. And Gen Z is an interesting generation simply because born between 1997 and 2012, these guys are what's called a digital natives. Right, so these guys grew up with a phone in their hand. Regardless of socioeconomic status as well, this technology just became so much more affordable and abundant in our society that, kids from that generation actually always had a phone, for one reason or another, if only for their parents to kind of keep tabs on them or whatever. So it's an interesting time to be alive for Gen Z, who grew up with technology and never experienced the world without it. They grew up with social media. It was always around during their lifetime. There was never a time where, you just kind of had the street where you would meet your friends. Social media has been a very real kind of social interaction platform for Gen Z. And this is also, the generation that grew up with things like, cyberbullying. Cyberbullying became a really, a very real thing for this generation. It was just as tangible as, the schoolyard bullying that every other generation may have experienced. So, it kind of added a whole another layer to it. And kind of made them more susceptible to being victimized in different ways. I think in a lot of ways Gen Z is also a lot more pragmatic and realistic. I think they don't really get involved in politics as much simply because they're kind of so disassociated with the system that rather than kind of raging against the machine and fighting the power, they would rather just step away and let the crazies do their own thing, which, fair enough. I think it's not a bad idea. It's gonna be interesting seeing what Gen Z brings us. Because they also had to live through a lot of times of uncertainty. The economy seems to be just free falling into the crapper. They've had to live through COVID-19 in a very different way to most other people. To be young during this time, to have your schooling affected by lockdowns, to have certain rights of, passage into adulthood, like turning 18, going out night clubbing, etc., being, having that taken away by things like lockdowns. So it's going to be interesting to see what impact this kind of has on Gen Z as they get older. Finally, after Gen Z, there is Generation Alpha, but considering that the oldest member of this generation would be 10 years old right now, I think this is a topic for a few years' time. But in any case, see, this is our society in a nutshell. This is us, from the oldest to the youngest, and these are the things that kind of shaped who we are and our dynamic between each other. And I do have to say, I do have to single out the baby boomers in some way here because we are still living in a baby boomer world. We live in with laws and policies set out around baby boomers. We live in an economy that, that kind of was set for the baby boomers and never really changed, especially now that they're retiring and kind of getting old. They're not about to give that up. So, interesting, isn't it? But in any case, one time for your mind, I hope you enjoy this little journey. I think this will set the foundation for where we're going forward from this, and we're going to get into the darker parts of the forest. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you come back. I'll see you next time. One time for your mind. I'm Architect AP, and this is Versus Everything.